Chapter 5. The inner workings of the clock had quieted, and Scrooge trembled with fear as he stared at the phantom spectre growing larger in front of his eyes. The spirit had no face or features of any kind. It was just a dark shadow that loomed above him ominously. Scrooge dropped to his knees and clasped his hands together. "Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come?" he asked, his teeth chattering. The spectre did not move or respond in any way. Despite the silence, Scrooge knew exactly what stood before him. "You are about to show me shadows of the things You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not yet happened, but will happen," Scrooge exclaimed. "Is that so, Spirit?" Scrooge shook uncontrollably, but the ghost remained perfectly silent and still. "Ghost of the future," he said, near tears, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. But I know your purpose is to do me good. I am prepared to bear you company. Lead me." The spirit still refused to move or respond in the slightest, and this silence shook Scrooge to the core. This was the visit he had been dreading the most, and he wanted to get it over with. "The night is waning fast," Scrooge told the spectre. "It's precious time to me. Lead on, spirit." The anger in Scrooge's voice enraged the spirit. Suddenly it tore its silhouette away from the surface of the mist and lunged directly at Scrooge. Terrified, Scrooge fell backward, but rather than hit the floor, he continued to fall, tumbling head over heels down a long and narrow spiral staircase. It was an agonizing fall, and Scrooge slammed his head and tailbone into step after step before mercifully coming to a stop at the stairway's bottom. When he caught his breath and sat up, he found himself outside the entrance to the Royal Exchange. This relieved him greatly. Scrooge was proud to be a member of the Exchange, and when he looked up, he saw 3 men who he recognized, although he could not quite remember their names. They had no awareness of him, or of the fact that he had just passed right through their bodies when he landed. "When did he die?" asked one. "Last night, I believe," another answered, "or sometime on Christmas Day." The third man just shook his head. "I thought he'd never die. What was the matter with him?" "God knows," the first said with a yawn. The second man raised an eyebrow as he asked, "What's he done with his money?" He hasn't left it to me," one answered with a shrug. "That's all I know." This was greeted by a laugh, and Scrooge could not help but wonder why the spirit wanted him to hear such trivial conversation. They weren't even interested in the dead man. Why should he be? "It's likely to be a cheap funeral," the third one said. I don't know anyone who'd go to it." "I don't mind going," one said with a laugh, "if a lunch is provided." Still dazed by his fall, Scrooge staggered up to his feet. Maybe he was supposed to wander outside the Exchange and find a conversation that would help him with his lesson. But when he got up to do so, all of the people who had lined the street disappeared. Suddenly, Ebenezer Scrooge was all alone on Threadneedle Street. Snow fell silently, and Scrooge looked for any signs of life. All he saw was the spirit's shadow slithering over the stairs of the Exchange. When he turned to see the phantom itself, there were only the flickering gaslights that lined the street. The spirit was nothing more than a shadow. Scrooge looked at it, and the finger of the shadow pointed down the street. Ebenezer followed its path and saw a horse-drawn hearse appear at the end of the street. Scrooge wondered if perhaps it had something to do with the dead man the 3 were just talking about. Then he recognized it. It was the hearse that had pulled Jacob Marley to his grave 7 years ago. It was the same ghostly hearse that had chased Scrooge up the stairs of his house earlier that Christmas Eve. When the horses turned towards Scrooge, Steam rose off their warm bodies and from their flaring nostrils. Scrooge gulped and slowly backed away. The shadowy finger turned and pointed right at him. With a crack of the whip from the driver, the horses started pulling the hearse down the street, charging straight for Scrooge. Ebenezer tried to scurry out of the way, but his slippers had no traction, and no matter how fast he pumped his legs, they failed uselessly. The horses increased their gallop and continued right toward him, the driver carefully righting the hearse as its wheels slid side to side along the icy road. Scrooge's slippers finally gained a shred of traction, and he started running wildly away from the oncoming hearse. It was too late. As the vehicle reached him, the driver stood for a final crack of the whip, but this one was aimed at Scrooge himself. It cracked just above his head with a thunderous roar that literally shook him to the bone. The shock wave echoed throughout the street, and in its wake, buildings melted and cobblestones shattered. The entire world seemed to collapse upon the terrified old man. Scrooge held his head in agony and crumpled to the ground. As he did, Threadneedle Street ceased to exist, and the setting changed into a dark and dirty alleyway. In the alleyway, everything seemed to be growing. Buildings stretched out of proportion. People stretched into gigantic shapes. Then Scrooge realized that they weren't growing. He was shrinking. He was getting smaller by the second, but he had no time to consider this because the hearse continued to chase him. He looked back over his shoulder and saw that the spirit was now driving the hearse, and as the stallion's hooves slammed the cobblestones around him, Scrooge saw the phantom leap from the hearse and straddle the backs of the horses. By this time, Scrooge was no bigger than a rat, and the spirit reached its shadowy arm down to the ground and grabbed him, surrounding him in darkness. After a long moment, the darkness gave way to the tiniest bit of light, and Scrooge was once again his normal size. He found himself in a cold and dreary room, devoid of almost all color. In the middle of the room was a bed. A shaft of unearthly pale light outlined a human form covered by an old, ragged sheet. It was, Scrooge knew instantly, the dead man of whom the others had spoken so contemptuously. A candle flickered on the nightstand by the bed and cast a shadow of the phantom on the wall. The spirit pointed its finger at the body for Scrooge to look. "This is a fearful place," he told the spirit. "When I leave it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me, let's go." Once again the phantom pointed toward the body. I understand, and I would if I could," Scrooge said, terrified to look at the face of the corpse, "but I have not the power." The ghost turned so that its unseen eyes were focused right on Scrooge. Ebenezer could not bear the sight of this dead body left all alone, with no one to mourn or miss him. He was almost certain that the body was his. "If there is any person who feels emotion caused by this man's death," he pleaded, "show that person to me, I beg you." Suddenly a burst of light enveloped them, and when it passed, Scrooge and the phantom were inside a modest home. Scrooge did not recognize the house or the young mother rocking a baby in her arms. A door opened and her husband walked in. This man also seemed completely unfamiliar, and Scrooge could not figure out how this family might feel emotion at the death of the man he feared was himself. "Is it good or bad?" the woman asked. "Bad," the man said, biting his lip. The woman looked down at the floor. "Are we ruined?" "No," her husband answered. "There is hope yet." She shook her head. "Only if he relents." "He's past relenting," said the man, now beginning to smile. "He's dead." "Thank God!" the woman shouted with glee. Moments later she felt guilty for greeting the news this way and asked a silent prayer for forgiveness. To whom will our debts be transferred?" she continued. I don't know, but then we'll be ready with the money." "I don't know, But then we'll be ready with the money, he assured her. And even if we are not, it's unlikely any new creditor could ever be so merciless. We can sleep tonight with light hearts. Scrooge was devastated. When he asked to see emotion tied to the death, he did not imagine that emotion would be happiness. Before he could say a word, the images faded away, and Ebenezer once again found himself in the room with the dead man. The phantom pointed, and again Scrooge pleaded with him. "Let me see some tenderness connected with a death," he begged the spirit, "or this dark chamber will forever haunt me." Another light enveloped them, and this time they were transported to the Cratchit house. Scrooge found himself standing on the narrow staircase, and the fire from the fireplace cast the phantom's shadow on the wall beside him. Ebenezer looked down at the family table, the same one at which he'd seen the joyous Christmas dinner. But now it was solemn. Miss Cratchit sat with her children. The mood in the room was very different from before. The happiness of the holiday had been replaced with quiet and sadness. "And he took a child and set him in the midst of them," the eldest son Peter read from the Bible. Once he was done, he closed the book and set it on the table in front of him. "It's late," Miss Cratchit said, looking at the clock. "It's past your father's time." Her son looked up at her. "He's walked slower these last few evenings." "He has walked with Tiny Tim on his shoulder, fast indeed," Miss Cratchit said, her voice cracking with sadness. But he was very light to carry, and your father loved him so." A moment later, Bob Cratchit came in through the door. The children got up to greet him, and though he gave them hugs, there was a definite sadness about him. His boyish charm and enthusiasm were gone. He seemed much older than before. He had just come back from the cemetery. Miss Cratchit looked at her husband and tried to smile. "You went today?" "Yes, my dear," Cratchit said, as he sat by the fire. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there every Sunday." It was at this point that Bob Cratchit began to cry. "Oh, my child," he wailed. "My little child." The children surrounded him and did their best to console him. It was a gesture he greatly appreciated. "I am sure none of us shall ever forget our poor Tiny Tim," he said. "Never, father," the children replied. "Thank you, my dears," he told them. Cratchit hugged each of his children and climbed up the narrow staircase. At one point it seemed as though he and Scrooge were looking each other in the eye, but the clerk had no true awareness of the spirit that was watching him. Tears filled Scrooge's eyes as he watched Cratchit enter a small room. In the middle of the room was a bed, and on that bed lay the dead body of Tiny Tim. This room was the opposite of the one with the other corpse. It was brightly lit and fully decorated for Christmas. It was the room of a person who had been truly loved in life. Cratchit bent over and kissed Tim's forehead, and then he sat next to the bed and began to sob. Scrooge was overcome with grief and fear. He turned to the spirit. "Spectre, something tells me our parting moment is at hand," he said. "Tell me, who was that man we saw lying dead?" The spirit waved his shadow of an arm, and a tornado-force wind whipped through the house, tearing it into 1,000 pieces. When the wind had passed, Scrooge found himself alone in a dark and desolate churchyard. Scrooge slowly walked across the frozen ground of the cemetery as gnarled trees swayed in the winter wind. A full moon cast its light across the graveyard, and with it came the terrifying shadow of the ghost of Christmas yet to come. It pointed to a lonely, unattended gravestone, away from the others and overrun by weeds. Scrooge knew that he must proceed and read the name on the stone, but before he could, he turned and pleaded once more with the haunting spirit. "Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point," Scrooge said, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or the shadows of things that may be?" Again the ghost gestured to the headstone. as the wind caused ripples to pass through its indistant form. "Men's courses in life foreshadow certain ends," Scrooge continued, "but if these courses be departed from, these ends will change. Isn't that so?" The shadow lowered its arm and revealed the name on the marker. It read, Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge dropped to his knees and cried out, am I the man who lay upon the bed?" The phantom unleashed a gust of wind that blew away some of the snow covering the bottom of the headstone. It read, "Born February 7th, 1786. Suddenly, another gust came and slowly pushed away the snow that covered Scrooge's date of death. "Hear me," Scrooge shouted, terrified of learning the day that he would die. I'm not the man I was. Why show me this if I'm past all hope?" The snow blew away and uncovered more of the date, showing that he would die on December 25th, Christmas Day. "Good Spirit, assure me that I may change these shadows you have shown me," he cried as the snow began to uncover the year of his death. As he begged, his feet slowly began to sink into the ground above the grave. He tried to climb out, but that only opened the ground even more. Suddenly, all of the dirt fell out from beneath him, and Scrooge was at the top of a giant hole. He grabbed onto a protruding tree branch and dangled above the grave. Ebenezer looked down into the hole, and to his horror, he saw a coffin resting beneath him. He let out a blood-curdling scream as the lid of the coffin opened, revealing the box to be empty. "Help, Spirit!" he screamed as the branch began to break free, lowering him closer and closer to the pine box below. He looked up and saw that the phantom was now staring down at him, and for the first time he saw something other than shadow. He saw two glowing eyes filled with death and terror. They pierced right through him. "No, Spirit," he pleaded. "I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year." The phantom's eyes flared. "I will not shut out the lessons of the past, nor the present, nor the future," Scrooge yelled. "Tell me I may sponge away the writing on that stone." The phantom reached down to him, and Scrooge did not know what to do. There was no way to grab hold of a shadow. There was no way the spirit could help him. But as the phantom's eyes narrowed, Scrooge suddenly felt a sense of peacefulness. He let go of the branch and fell down into the grave, his arms and legs flailing. He spun over and fell face down, heading straight for the coffin. Right before he hit, he closed his eyes and braced for impact. But it never came. He was stopped cold by some unseen force and left dangling. Scrooge carefully opened his eyes, and just a hair's breadth before him, he saw a bull's eye-shaped knot in the wood.